Moving on now to U.S. involvement of a different kind, this in Libya, and what will happen next there. There's a meeting going on in Paris. It's called the Friends of Libya Conference. Leaders from 60 countries are there to discuss Libya's National Transitional Council and life after Gaddafi. RT's EU correspondent Daniel Bushell is in Brussels and has more on what's shaping up in terms of this planning for the future. Hey there, Daniel. I know that this was a long and costly military intervention for NATO. What are you gathering this transition of power will look like based on this conference?
Well, people back from Tripoli say it's a mess. There's no police on the streets, the hospitals and schools aren't working, and the weapons stores of Libya have been raided in the chaos. One man has told me that every man now has a Kalashnikov on the streets, and they're being traded for pennies. And even more worryingly, the rebel leaders themselves don't seem to know who their fighters are composed of, as well as the Islamists that you might expect and the anti-Western Arab nationalists. President Jalil, the new president of Libya, was amazed to find that a column of al-Qaeda fighters had joined his offensive on Tripoli. And Hillary Clinton has just said that NATO will continue to help militarily the Libyans as long as they need it, which suggests that NATO's problems have only just begun.
It's really interesting, though. I'm curious how NATO is justifying what's happening now, especially in light of the fact that, you know, as you say, some crazy things are going on the streets in Tripoli. And originally, NATO said their stated goal was the protection of the civilian population. But from what I understand, the rebels are continuing to push through and storm areas that are still, you know, somewhat under the control of Gaddafi supporters. So shouldn't NATO then still be protecting those who are in danger, even if they now happen to be in places the rebels are attacking? I mean, how do they justify this?
Well, NATO's justification at this meeting in Paris, they've reiterated, is that Gaddafi is a threat to his own people. It's not quite clear who gave NATO the right to be judge and jury on whether Gaddafi should be hunted down and whether they have the right to hunt down and kill Gaddafi. Certainly not the original international mandate giving them permission to intervene in the country. Now, if the eastern part of Libya, which is traditionally more anti-Gaddafi, supported NATO involvement, it's very much under doubt whether the tribes, the hundreds of tribes across the west and south, which are traditionally more pro-Gaddafi, want to be bombed in this way by NATO. That's certainly under question at the moment.
I want to go back to something you spoke about just a moment ago about al-Qaeda being involved in the rebel movement. How do, you know, U.S. and other Western leaders justify sort of being the friends of Libya when, A, there's a lot of confusion about exactly who is in the National Transitional Council and who will be the future leadership? I mean, is that being discussed at all?
Well, it is being discussed, but many will say that the lives of people under NATO is getting worse. I mean, we were talking about Afghanistan, also in Iraq and in Libya, and certainly the transition here seems to be more chaotic. There seems to be little question about that than before it. I mean, the stability of the country has been totally blown out of the water. I mean, one diplomat says the people used to see NATO and the United States as their hope. Certainly, if you speak to people on the streets now, they're full of hatred and anger for the West. So it raises the question, have they created a hornet's nest for themselves? Because if Gaddafi certainly was no one's favourite person across the world, the question is, has the transition created by this, helped by NATO's bombardment, created an even worse enemy for the West?
I think that's such an important point that you bring up. A lot of people sort of trying to make some historical connections here and making some comparisons with other places. I know it was about 10 years ago, after all, that many NATO countries were pretty excited about a new leader in power. I'm talking about Hamid Karzai in Afghanistan. I'm wondering, from what you're gathering there, do you think as a result of things, you know, working out not quite the way people expected in Afghanistan, that these friends of Libya will be a little more reluctant to support and be excited about future leaders in Libya?
Well, look, I was talking to a women's rights activist yesterday. She said that Tunisia got abortion rights 20 years before women here in the West, women here in Belgium, where I am speaking to you from. So under the previous regime, women, for example, are allowed to walk freely on the streets. That's just one example. They had abortion rights, they had divorce benefits, as we call it here in Europe. They got money from the government. Now that Libya is in chaos and the Islamists and religious extremists have got a foothold and are using Libya as a base from which to spread their ideas across North Africa and beyond, there are fears that now the rights that were actually limited, they may be, under the previous regime are now being erased. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the comparisons you raise with Afghanistan, of course, Iraq is often also quoted, but many people will say that the rights that people enjoyed before under the previous unsavoury regimes were perhaps even better than the ones they enjoy now in the chaos.
Very, very interesting. I mean, no matter what, when you get people from the Western world used to a very different kind of government involved in getting involved with, you know, what has for thousands of years been tribal, it's just hard to imagine that they can really understand and get a grasp on how to move forward. Daniel Bushell, RT correspondent, joining us from Brussels, Belgium. Thanks so much.